January 1944. The night sky above Detroit is not dark. It glows. Furnaces roar, cranes swing like the arms of titans, and sparks rain down from steel skeletons that never stop moving. The hum of machines rolls through the frozen air like thunder. Inside, under white lamps that burn through the night, thousands of men and women work shoulder to shoulder. Grease, sweat, and rhythm. The sound of war built not on the battlefield, but in the factory. Beyond the chain-link fences, a convoy of guarded buses slows to a halt. Inside them sit German officers, captured in North Africa, still wearing crisp uniforms, their insignia dulled by dust and surrender. They stare silently through the frosted glass. They had imagined American factories as small, quiet places, run by amateurs. Instead, they see rivers of molten steel, trucks loaded by the minute, engines tested without pause. One officer leans forward, his breath fogging the window. He whispers to another, barely audible. They don't sleep. The truth is only beginning to dawn. In 1939, when Europe erupted into flames, America slept beneath the hum of peacetime. The Great Depression still lingered, and isolationism was an iron curtain drawn around the nation's heart. Factories built cars, not tanks. Planes carried mail, not bombs. Across the Atlantic, the German war machine moved like a storm. Swift, precise, unstoppable. Blitzkrieg had a rhythm all its own. Lightning-fast tanks, disciplined infantry, and an industrial backbone powered by conquest and forced labor. In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt watched with careful unease. He knew that neutrality could not last. "We must be the great arsenal of democracy," he declared in December 1940. It was not a boast. It was a prophecy. Factories that once produced refrigerators and automobiles began to receive new blueprints: tanks, bombers, and guns. The names that had built America's economy, Ford, Chrysler, General Motors, Boeing, were about to forge its defense. By mid-1941, the transformation had begun. Civilian assembly lines were stripped of chrome and luxury, their gears recalibrated for war. Ford's massive River Rouge plant in Dearborn was among the first to convert. Entire car lines were replaced with armored hulls and Pratt & Whitney engines. In California, the Douglas Aircraft Company expanded its floors until they ran out of space, so they built new ones overnight. The workers changed too. Millions of men joined the army, and their places on the production line were filled by women. Rosie the Riveter became more than a poster. She was a nation's heartbeat. Over 6 million women would take jobs in factories, shipyards, and arsenals. They learned welding, riveting, and machining in weeks. It was not propaganda. It was survival. Meanwhile, German strategists observed from afar. Reports from their intelligence officers painted a fragmented picture of America. Disorganized, indulgent, incapable of sustaining prolonged war. Joseph Goebbels's propaganda ministry mocked the United States as a nation of consumers, suggesting they could not endure hardship. But what German planners failed to grasp was the power of freedom, the ability to choose, to adapt, to unite under necessity rather than decree. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, that dormant power awoke with thunder. Within months, factories that had built cars were rolling out tanks. Coca-Cola trucks became fuel carriers. Railroads ran without pause. America's industrial gears locked into motion, and once they turned, they did not stop. The War Production Board, formed in January 1942, became the unseen general of the home front. Its mission was simple: coordinate everything. Steel, rubber, fuel, and manpower all were counted, allocated, and driven into a single purpose. The board ordered 50,000 planes for 1942. It was a target few believed possible. By the year's end, 47,800 had flown. In Germany, military analysts began to notice something unusual. Even under relentless U-boat attacks, Allied convoys grew stronger, not weaker. American ships arrived faster than submarines could sink them. Tanks appeared on multiple fronts, identical in design, produced with terrifying efficiency. This was not coincidence. It was systematized power. The American industrial base had become a weapon unto itself. It operated not for profit, but for survival. By the summer of 1942, the United States was producing more war material than the Axis combined. The numbers defied belief. 1,000 aircraft per year, 20,000 tanks, million tons of shipping, ammunition so vast that even the front-line generals lost count. And yet, the factories did not rest. Day and night, the furnaces burned. The workers labored in shifts, dawn, dusk, midnight, until the concept of closing time disappeared entirely. When German soldiers were captured in North Africa the following year, many were officers, men who had studied engineering, logistics, and command. They prided themselves on the precision of German production. Krupp steel, Messerschmitt aircraft, the mighty panzer divisions. But soon, they would be transported to a world where industrial warfare existed on a scale they could not comprehend. They would see what Roosevelt meant by the arsenal of democracy. And what they saw would challenge everything they believed about power, endurance, and the human spirit. By early 1943, the transformation of the United States was complete. From the Atlantic coast to the Pacific, a single rhythm pulsed through the nation, the rhythm of production. The night shift had become as vital as the day. Cities that once slept now glowed under floodlights, their skies tinted orange by the reflection of molten steel. Entire industries vanished overnight, reborn under military contracts. Typewriter companies now produced machine gun parts. Toy manufacturers molded ammunition belts. Silk once used for women's dresses became parachutes for airborne divisions. Rubber was rationed. Fuel was measured in victory miles. Everything that could serve the war did, and nothing that couldn't was wasted. The numbers were staggering. In just 12 months, American workers had built 48,000 aircraft, a feat unmatched in history. The Ford Willow Run plant in Michigan, dubbed the Arsenal of Democracy, produced one B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes. The plant stretched nearly a mile long, its ceiling high enough for cranes to lift entire wings into place. The assembly lines were manned not by soldiers, but by teenagers, mothers, and retirees. Ordinary citizens who understood that victory began with work. In the Pacific, shipyards in San Francisco and Seattle launched Liberty ships at a pace that stunned naval historians. One vessel, the SS Robert E. Peary, was constructed in just 4 days and 15 hours, a record that shocked even American engineers. While Axis forces celebrated tank deliveries by the dozens, America delivered them by the thousands. It was during this time that the first groups of German prisoners began arriving on U.S. soil. Captured in Tunisia and Sicily, they were transported across the Atlantic in secret, guarded convoys. Many believed they were being taken to bleak, isolated camps. Instead, they found themselves in a nation that was not only safe from war, but thriving within it. At Camp Swift in Texas, Camp Shanks in New York, and Fort Robinson in Nebraska, German officers were given work details, food, and shelter. Some were assigned to tasks near industrial centers, helping harvest crops or repair rail lines. It was then, during brief transit stops, that many caught glimpses of the machine that had defeated them. A few were even escorted through manufacturing centers for security or observation purposes. The sight left them speechless. Factories ran in shifts that never ended. Women operated cranes and welders with practiced precision. Cafeterias fed thousands in minutes. Conveyor belts carried engines like clockwork. Electric lights blazed through the night. a luxury unimaginable in wartime Europe, where cities lived under blackout orders. For these officers, the revelation was not simply about machinery, it was about spirit. In Germany, production was driven by fear, by obedience to command. In America, it was driven by belief. Workers smiled, sang, argued, laughed, and still met impossible quotas. They were not ordered to fight. They chose to contribute. Reports from German POW debriefings later recorded their astonishment. One officer, a logistics specialist from the Africa Corps, told his interrogators, "We thought America was a country of soft men and women. We were wrong. They build war as if it were music." Meanwhile, on the German home front, factories struggled under Allied bombing. Skilled workers were drafted into the army. Raw materials grew scarce. Assembly lines were halted, relocated, rebuilt. The Nazi regime forced prisoners of war and civilians from occupied countries into labor, a system built on coercion and desperation. Across the Atlantic, the contrast could not have been greater. Even as casualty lists grew, American factories expanded. There was no retreat, no silence, only motion, ceaseless, steady, overwhelming. By 1943, U.S. industrial output had surpassed the combined production of Germany, Italy, and Japan. The Allies were armed, fueled, and supplied for total victory. And somewhere in the heart of America, under the glow of factory lights, a truth was forged as powerful as any weapon. The nation that could outbuild its enemies could outlast them. Soon, this truth would take form on the battlefield, in Normandy, in the skies above Europe, and in the hearts of those who witnessed the impossible becoming real. They came from every corner of America, from dusty farms, crowded cities, and small towns where the sound of a factory whistle now meant hope. They were welders, typists, machinists, and riveters. Some had never touched a wrench before 1942. Others had built cars, radios, or furniture. Now, they built victory. Inside the factories, the rhythm of work replaced the rhythm of fear. The clang of steel echoed with purpose. Radios played swing music as women fastened bolts on B-17 wings. Immigrants who had fled war-torn Europe stood beside second-generation Americans, both driven by the same conviction that tyranny must not win. Rosie the Riveter was no myth. She was real. Millions of her. She stood on ladders, hands blackened by oil, hair tucked beneath a kerchief. She learned fast, worked hard, and never complained. In every state, women filled the roles men had left behind. African-American workers, once excluded from industrial jobs, now found themselves essential. Their contribution was not only material but moral, proof that the fight for freedom began at home as well as abroad. When war plants posted targets, the workers shattered them. They did not see production quotas as orders. They saw them as promises. For many, the long hours were personal. Sons in Europe, brothers in the Pacific. Every rivet, every bolt was a heartbeat sent across the ocean. What Germany underestimated most was not the firepower of American guns, but the efficiency behind them. Logistics, the art of movement, timing, and supply became the invisible blade of Allied success. Every bullet, tank, and meal had a route, a mathematical thread running from Kansas cornfields to Normandy beaches. The U.S. Army's Transportation Corps operated like a living organism. Freight cars crossed the continent in synchronized waves, coordinated by telegraph and code. The Port of New York handled more cargo than the entire Axis merchant fleet combined. The Red Ball Express, a convoy system created after D-Day, became a symbol of unstoppable momentum. Thousands of trucks ran day and night, their headlights blacked out, guided only by cat-eye paint and instinct. The drivers were often African-American soldiers, navigating bomb-cratered roads to deliver fuel and ammunition to the front lines. Without them, Patton's tanks would have stalled in France. German strategists could not comprehend it. They had built armies of precision, but not of endurance. Their supply lines stretched thin. Their fuel reserves dwindled. America's, in contrast, were infinite rivers of steel, gasoline, and grit. The American industrial miracle was not simply vast, it was ingenious. Engineers reimagined manufacturing itself. The key was standardization. Every tank shared identical components. Every aircraft engine could fit any airframe of its model. This meant factories across the country could produce interchangeable parts that assembled seamlessly anywhere. The Detroit Arsenal Tank Plant, designed by architect Albert Kahn, became a fortress of innovation. It produced the M4 Sherman in such numbers that by 1945, more than 49,000 had rolled off assembly lines. Each was slightly improved. The design continuously refined even during mass production. Aircraft factories became cathedrals of aluminum. At Willow Run, women riveters constructed bomber wings so large they stretched from one hangar door to the next. In Seattle, Boeing's Plant 2 built the B-17 Flying Fortress at a rate that left German intelligence analysts in disbelief. Technological breakthroughs were constant. Radar, synthetic rubber, mass-produced penicillin, each born from necessity, each a weapon in its own right. The American genius was not perfection, it was practicality. The machines were not elegant, but they worked. They could be repaired in the field, replicated quickly, and improved constantly. While German engineers built masterpieces, Americans built armies, and those armies rolled forward, powered by an industrial spirit that could not be bombed, starved, or broken. The human heart, the logistical mind, and the mechanical hand, together, they formed a weapon more powerful than any single gun. But across the Atlantic, the enemy was watching, confused and unnerved. Reports filtered back to Berlin, describing impossible quantities of steel and light. Soon, German officers would see the source of that power for themselves, not in reports, but with their own eyes. By late 1943, as the tide of war began to turn, German intelligence analysts faced a riddle they could not solve. How could a nation that had entered the war so late produce more weapons, more planes, and more ships than all of Europe combined? Reports from U-boat commanders described convoys stretching beyond the horizon. Prisoner interrogations hinted that American factories worked in 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. The data didn't seem real. It defied every known metric of production. When the first captured German officers were transported to the United States, the truth struck them with the force of revelation. Through the narrow bus windows, they saw endless factories blazing with light at midnight. Workers streamed in and out in uniformed shifts. Train cars full of tank hulls rattled down glowing tracks. At a POW camp near Chicago, several officers were permitted to assist with non-sensitive logistics work. One, a former engineer from the Ruhr, later told interrogators, "In Germany, one bomb stops a factory for a week. Here, you could bomb for a year and never stop this machine." To these men, the experience was not merely industrial, it was cultural. In Germany, production was an act of obedience. In America, it was an act of belief. The sheer freedom of motion, the confidence of a society that trusted its people to build, to innovate, to act, was something the rigid hierarchies of the Reich could not reproduce. And the most painful realization of all, this was the engine that had already won the war. Even before the front lines knew it, President Franklin D. Roosevelt never set foot in a battlefield. Yet he commanded one of the most powerful armies in history, the Army of Industry. His genius lay not only in vision, but in delegation. He surrounded himself with men who understood scale. Bernard Baruch, Donald Nelson, and Henry Kaiser, architects of the war economy. Kaiser, known as the miracle shipbuilder, turned shipyards into industrial orchestras. His methods cut ship construction time from months to days. He believed morale was as critical as machinery, installing cafeterias, childcare centers, and medical clinics to keep his workers thriving. It was a philosophy alien to both German and Japanese systems, where exhaustion and fear were the engines of output. General George C. Marshall and industrial czar Donald Nelson coordinated the impossible, turning a civilian economy into a war machine without collapsing it. Roosevelt's Arsenal of Democracy speech had set the tone. These men made it real. They balanced scarcity with speed, improvisation with precision, chaos with order. Behind them, the War Production Board served as the unseen general staff. Its memos were battle plans, its charts, maps of material conquests. By 1944, America produced 300,000 planes, 100,000 tanks, and 2.4 million trucks. And yet, food and consumer goods still flowed to civilians. It was not just management. It was orchestration. This leadership was not born of fear or ideology, but of coordination. Thousands of minds solving one problem: how to outproduce tyranny. Beneath all the machinery and numbers, there was something deeper, a moral divide that defined the war itself. Germany's factories relied on forced labor, prisoners, and slaves. Theirs was an economy of coercion, where the cost of failure was death. The workers toiled in silence, under guards, in darkness. In America, the opposite was true. The same men and women who built tanks by day danced in halls by night. They bought war bonds, volunteered for drives, and shared meals in factory cafeterias. They joked, complained, and dreamed. But they worked, freely and fiercely. That difference echoed in every shipment and every shell. Freedom, it turned out, was the ultimate production advantage. A society that valued initiative could improvise, innovate, and endure. For the German officers who later stood within those glowing plants, the realization was as heavy as the machines around them. They had fought against a nation that had weaponized liberty itself. By the winter of 1943, the pattern was clear. America's weapon was not merely steel or oil, it was motion. Relentless, organized, democratic motion. And soon, that motion would unleash its full force across the Atlantic, changing not just the outcome of battles, but the entire course of the war. Spring, 1944. The world had entered its decisive year. In secret bases across Britain, American and Allied forces gathered in preparation for what would become the largest amphibious invasion in history. Operation Overlord, D-Day, was not just a military endeavor. It was the physical manifestation of industrial supremacy. Every ship, tank, rifle, and ration that would cross the English Channel had its origins in the glowing furnaces and roaring assembly lines of the United States. While German generals studied maps and fortified the Atlantic Wall, the United States was producing history at an unprecedented scale. The War Department had become an empire of logistics, a machine that stretched from Detroit's auto plants to the beaches of Normandy. It was the age of movement, and the Americans had mastered it. By mid-1944, the numbers were staggering. 300,000 aircraft, 100,000 tanks, millions of trucks, guns, and artillery shells. These were not distant statistics. They were the very lifeblood of every soldier preparing to storm Fortress Europe. Factories like Willow Run, Pittsburgh steel mills, and the Boeing plants in Seattle operated under a new creed: production is victory. American workers no longer asked when the war would end, only how much more they could build before it did. In the planning rooms of the German High Command, reports of these figures were met with disbelief. Even Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, privately admitted that the Reich could not compete. In his later memoirs, Speer wrote, "The American production system was beyond our comprehension. Their factories were cities, their resources endless. But what struck the Germans hardest was not just the quantity, it was the precision. Every landing craft built for D-Day had a purpose. Every Sherman tank was equipped with standardized tools and spare parts. Fuel drums were coded, labeled, and shipped in mathematically timed convoys. Behind the invasion, an invisible war of logistics was already won before the first shot was fired. The assembly lines had become the arteries of liberation. When the invasion began on June 6, 1944, it was as if the entire American continent had lunged across the ocean. The beaches of Normandy shook under the weight of materiel, tanks rolling off ships, trucks stacked with rations, bulldozers carving paths through enemy defenses. The German defenders fought fiercely, but they faced an enemy that could not run out of anything. Not bullets, not food, not replacements. Even the German commanders on the ground began to sense the futility. Reports flooded back to Berlin. The Americans had everything. "They fight with machines," one officer remarked bitterly. "Even their supplies have supplies." The Allied advance through France was fueled by the same industrial engine that had stunned the POWs months earlier. When Patton's Third Army broke through at Avranches, it consumed 400,000 gallons of fuel per day. Yet the supply never faltered. Convoys rolled like clockwork, the Red Ball Express maintaining a constant flow between Normandy and the front lines. By contrast, German divisions struggled to move at all. Fuel shortages immobilized tanks. Ammunition arrived too late. The Luftwaffe, once a symbol of German innovation, was now outnumbered 10-1 in the air. Everywhere, the signs of imbalance grew. The Americans had turned production into a weapon as devastating as any bomb. Behind the battlefields, back home in America, the factories still burned through the night. Sparks rained down in the darkness of Ohio, California, Pennsylvania, symbols of endurance, of motion without pause. Each shift began where another ended. Children slept through the sound of freight trains carrying engines east. Workers marked their calendars not by months, but by milestones. Another 100 tanks, another 1,000 planes. The war had become a contest of rhythm, and the Germans were running out of time. By autumn, the Allies had crossed France. Paris was liberated. The industrial heartbeat of America echoed across Europe. Through every convoy, every rebuilt bridge, every airfield lined with fresh aircraft. And yet, even in defeat, the German officers who would soon be captured could not grasp the full magnitude of what powered their enemy. That revelation would come only when they set foot on American soil and saw the impossible with their own eyes. Autumn, 1944. The battle for Europe was raging. The Allied advance pressing toward Germany's western frontier. The American Army, now the largest and best supplied in the world, moved forward with a force that defied imagination. But behind every rifle, every tank tread, and every truck convoy stood something far more powerful than any general or gun: the American factory. Across the Atlantic, the machine did not rest. In Detroit, the Ford Motor Company produced tanks as though they were family cars. In California, Boeing and Douglas churned out bombers faster than German anti-aircraft batteries could destroy them. In Pittsburgh, furnaces blazed day and night, pouring steel for ships that hadn't even been designed yet. The German war effort, by contrast, was collapsing under its own weight. Allied bombing campaigns had gutted railways and oil refineries. Fuel had become more precious than gold. Hitler's armies were still disciplined, still defiant, but every bullet fired now carried the shadow of scarcity. When the Allied armies began capturing large groups of German officers in the West, many from elite divisions of the WWII, Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe, a number were transported to prisoner camps in the United States. For men raised on tales of American weakness and industrial chaos, what they found instead was a revelation bordering on disbelief. The arrival, the journey began aboard Liberty ships, the very vessels that symbolized American production itself. Built in weeks, not months, these cargo ships were proof that the United States had turned construction into science. When the German officers disembarked at East Coast ports, Norfolk, Boston, or New York, they expected silence, ration lines, blackout curtains. Instead, they found a nation ablaze with light. Trains rolled through the night without pause. Cities glowed in neon. Shop windows displayed abundance that, to them, bordered on decadence. One officer later recalled, "We were told America suffered from the Depression, from moral decay. Yet it looked like another world, a world untouched by war." Their transports passed through the heart of industrial America. Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan. Through frosted windows, they saw rivers of smoke and fire, buildings the size of villages, conveyor belts moving as far as the eye could see. At one stop near Detroit, several officers were allowed a short inspection of an auto plant converted for military use. What they saw rendered them silent, rows of welders, their faces shielded in sparks. Women guiding cranes with effortless precision. A completed engine lowered onto a chassis every few minutes. The factory was bright, loud, and tireless, a world without night. One colonel from the Africa Corps later told his interrogators, "In Germany, the night belongs to the siren. In America, the night belongs to the machine." They were seeing the secret weapon of the war. Not a single supertank or bomber, but an entire nation in motion. For these German prisoners, it was an experience bordering on humiliation, but also on wonder. Their war schools had taught them that the German industrial system, centralized, disciplined, perfected, was the height of efficiency. Yet here, they saw chaos organized into harmony. There was laughter on the factory floor. There was music in the cafeterias. And still, the output never faltered. In conversations recorded by U.S. intelligence, some officers compared what they saw to divine force, a power that multiplies itself. Others simply shook their heads, unable to reconcile what they witnessed with the propaganda they had believed. When asked what they thought of American production, one Luftwaffe engineer replied, "It is not machines that defeat us. It is will. The will of millions who build as if they were fighting." Even Albert Speer, in secret correspondence near the war's end, would acknowledge this same truth. In a memo to Hitler, he wrote that the Allied advantage lies in the boundless capacity of the Anglo-American system to produce war, material faster than we can destroy it. Die Tusen, German officers held in America could see this advantage with their own eyes. They would never forget it. By late 1944, as the Battle of the Bulge erupted, America's factories increased production again. Even while under no direct threat, they worked at wartime intensity. The Ruhr was burning. Berlin was starving. But across the Atlantic, Ford was already preparing post-war designs while building tanks by the hour. The German prisoners, now accustomed to the sight of perpetual motion, came to a single, humbling realization. The United States could have continued this war for 100 years if necessary. In their diaries and letters, some wrote of admiration, others of despair. "We never had a chance," one wrote. "They fight with factories." For these men, once the symbols of Germany's pride, the sight of those glowing American assembly lines was the true defeat. From that moment on, the war's outcome was no longer in question. Every bomb that fell, every ship that sailed, every victory on the front, all were echoes of the same unstoppable rhythm that had begun years before. In the forges of American industry, and when the final German strongholds fell, it was not just the Allies' armies that had triumphed, it was the factory workers, the welders, the machinists, and the unseen millions who had turned night into victory. May 1945. The guns fell silent, but the machines did not. When Germany surrendered, the war in Europe ended. Yet, in the heart of America, the furnaces still burned. Victory had been achieved not through miracle weapons or luck, but through the relentless heartbeat of industry. The same factories that had once forged the arsenal of democracy now began to forge the peace. For the thousands of German prisoners held across the United States, the war's end brought a strange quiet. Many had spent months laboring in agriculture or light repair work, integrated into small-town communities far removed from the devastation of Europe. They had eaten well, slept safely, and witnessed a world untouched by ruin. And for those who had glimpsed America's industrial heart, the memory of that sight stayed with them, a kind of revelation that outlasted the war itself. Reports compiled by the U.S. Army and the Red Cross after 1945 revealed something extraordinary. Many German POWs expressed admiration, even gratitude, toward their captors. They spoke of humane treatment, of music in the camps, of books and newspapers provided freely. But what struck them most was the vitality of American life. There was motion everywhere. Even in victory, America was not exhausted. It was accelerating. Several German officers, when repatriated, gave testimony to Allied and post-war German authorities about what they had seen. One recalled the night near Pittsburgh. The light from the factories reached the clouds. It was as if the whole sky was working. Another, a logistics officer from the 10th Panzer Division, described his astonishment at American rail networks. "I saw one train after another carrying tanks, each identical, perfectly built. We in Germany could no longer move 10 in a day." Their words became quiet admissions of defeat. Not military, but industrial. The Americans had mastered something the Germans never could: scale without chaos, innovation without collapse. For many of these men, returning to a destroyed homeland was a second shock. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden were in ruins. Factories once filled with the hum of machines were silent shells. The Ruhr, Germany's industrial core, lay shattered. And in those moments, the memory of the glowing American assembly lines took on the weight of prophecy. One POW wrote in his diary before leaving Camp Swift, Texas, "I saw America's future with my own eyes. Their power is not in bombs, but in belief. Belief that they can build anything." He was right. By the end of 1945, the United States had produced nearly half of all goods made in the world. No nation had ever achieved such dominance. Tanks and aircraft gave way once again to cars and refrigerators. The same production lines that had filled the skies over Europe now filled American homes with peacetime prosperity. For the Germans who had seen it firsthand, this transition was almost unthinkable. A nation capable of building bombers one year could produce automobiles the next, with no interruption, no despair. It was this adaptability, this refusal to stop moving, that defined the American post-war miracle. Some of the former POWs returned to visit the United States years later, invited by cultural exchange programs or corporations seeking skilled workers. Many admitted that their experience as prisoners had changed their understanding of democracy. What they once saw as chaos, they now recognized as strength. The industrial machine that had stunned them during war became, in peace, the foundation of a global order. Factories that had roared with fire now built bridges, trains, and engines of commerce. Yet beneath the calm surface of peacetime industry, the lesson of war remained. Production was power, and power was peace. The end of the Second World War did not bring an end to America's factories. It brought a transformation. What had begun as an emergency mobilization evolved into the foundation of an empire. The same assembly lines that produced tanks and bombers were retooled within months to produce cars, tractors, and machinery for a new world in reconstruction. In Europe, the scale of American production was now legend. The ruins of German cities stood as silent witnesses to a grim equation. The side that could build more lasted longer. The United States had outbuilt its enemies, outplanned its rivals, and now it would outproduce the peace? From 1946 onward, the United States launched the Marshall Plan, a vast reconstruction program that sent ships loaded with supplies across the Atlantic once more. Not for war, but for renewal. Flour, steel, locomotives, and raw materials flowed into the same ports once guarded by German guns. American-built trucks now drove through the ruins of Frankfurt, carrying hope instead of shells. For many former German officers, the irony was overwhelming. The very machine that had defeated them was now feeding them. Factories that once produced rifles were now building bridges. Ford's River Rouge plant, where the glow of molten steel once symbolized the arsenal of democracy, became the beacon of an industrial peace that seemed as unstoppable as its wartime output. Historians later called it the victory of systems. The German system had been built on hierarchy, fear, and rigidity. The American system thrived on flexibility, trust, and scale. While one broke under the pressure of total war, the other grew stronger with every demand placed upon it. The data told the story with brutal clarity. By 1945, the United States had produced 97,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 8,000 naval vessels, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition. Each figure represented not just metal, but morale. Every number was a measure of a nation's collective belief in its own ability to act, to build, to endure, to overcome. This industrial might would go on to define the post-war world. The Cold War that followed was as much a contest of factories as it was of ideologies. The Soviet Union could marshal armies, but it could not match the fluid, decentralized genius of American production. U.S. corporations like Boeing, General Motors, and Caterpillar became symbols of national strength, their roots tracing back to the same wartime lines that once forged victory. Meanwhile, in Germany, the story took a quieter, more reflective turn. Many former prisoners who had seen America's vast industrial heart returned home changed. They spoke of a nation that valued initiative over obedience, innovation over order. Some of them, engineers, foremen, designers, would become key figures in Germany's post-war industrial recovery. They helped shape what would later be known as the Wirtschaftswunder, the German economic miracle. Their inspiration had not come from ideology, but from observation. One former POW, later an executive in Stuttgart, wrote, "We learned in captivity that work could be free, that order could come from trust, not fear. It was an idea born from watching American factories that never slept." The consequences of that revelation rippled far beyond. 1945, America's wartime production not only secured victory, it redefined modern industry. The notion of continuous flow, standardization, and modular design became global practice. Nations studied the American system as if it were a new science. Yet beneath the statistics and strategies, something more human endured. In every city where factory lights once burned through the night, veterans returned home to find their mothers, sisters, and wives. The same women who had held the line at the assembly bench, waiting. The war had been won not by soldiers alone, but by a nation that refused to stop moving. And so, as peace settled over a weary world, the last rivet was not a symbol of war's end. It was the sound of a new beginning. The fire that once burned in America's wartime factories has long faded, but its light endures in memory. In the silence of those great industrial halls, now museums, warehouses, or corporate campuses, one can still sense the echo of that relentless rhythm. The clang of steel, the roar of furnaces, the heartbeat of a nation that refused to sleep. For the German officers who once stared through the frosted windows of a Detroit night, that memory never left them. They had come from a continent in ruins, from cities darkened by air raids and fear. In America, They saw a world powered by confidence, a democracy that fought not through cruelty or conquest, but through creation. What they witnessed was not merely industry, it was will, a collective will so vast that it transformed ordinary citizens into builders of history. Men and women who had never seen a battlefield became the soldiers of the home front. Their weapons were wrenches and welding torches, their victories measured in production charts and assembly counts. The story of those sleepless factories is more than a tale of wartime success. It is the story of how freedom works, how trust, ingenuity, and shared purpose can move mountains of steel and change the course of the world. When the furnaces finally cooled and peace returned, America stood as both victor and builder. Its cities gleamed, its people prospered, and its machines, born for destruction, found new life in creation. History would remember the battles, the generals, and the victories. But behind them all was the steady hum of industry, a sound that told a deeper truth, that the might of a free people, united in purpose, can outlast any empire, outbuild any tyrant, and light the darkest night.